The ocean was vast, endless, and silent. To the Japanese Empire in the early 1940s, it seemed like a protective wall, a vast moat around their island nation. But hidden beneath the rolling waves, invisible and merciless, moved the hunters that would slowly strangle an empire. They were not battleships, nor carriers with screaming aircraft. They were wolves in the deep, silent predators that stalked the Pacific night after night, the American submarines. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the United States Navy was humiliated, wounded, and desperate. But from the wreckage rose a weapon the Japanese underestimated. Submarines, only a small part of America's fleet at the time, were about to become its deadliest. The Japanese thought they had crippled the American will to fight, but what they had really done was awaken a force that would not face them in grand battles, but would instead quietly cut the lifeline of their empire. This is the story of how steel coffins turned into steel wolves, how silent hunters beneath the Pacific waves starved Japan into defeat. Imagine the Pacific in those years. Japan had expanded rapidly, swallowing territories across Asia and the Pacific Islands. Its empire relied on a single artery: merchant ships carrying oil, food, iron, and soldiers across the sea. Without those ships, factories would grind to a halt, soldiers would go hungry, planes would rust, and war itself would suffocate. But the Japanese Navy, confident and proud, believed its mighty warships could protect those lifelines. They were wrong. At first, the American submarine campaign stumbled. Faulty torpedoes often failed to explode, captains were cautious, and tactics untested. Submarines would sneak up on Japanese convoys, fire their deadly weapons, and watch in horror as the torpedoes either veered off course or struck the target and failed to detonate. It was a nightmare. Brave crews risked everything, only to see their weapons betray them. But as months passed, engineers fixed the flaws, tactics hardened, and a new generation of ruthless commanders took control. The hunt began in earnest. Beneath the surface, life was hell. The submariners lived in cramped steel tubes, soaked in sweat, air thick with diesel fumes, constantly alert for the sound of enemy destroyers above. Sleep was scarce, fear constant, and death often came suddenly, in the form of depth charges raining down like underwater thunder. Yet despite the conditions, these crews pressed forward, day after day, mission after mission. Each time they slipped out of Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, they carried not just torpedoes, but the weight of starving an empire. Convoy after convoy fell victim. A single submarine, hidden in the vast Pacific, could cripple a fleet of merchant ships before vanishing into the dark. Japanese sailors began to fear the sea itself, because beneath it lurked an unseen killer. Merchant ships burned, oil tankers split in two, supplies meant for soldiers never arrived. Japan's war machine began to choke. The power of these wolves was not in single strikes, but in persistence. By 1944, the noose was tightening. Japan's empire was vast, but without fuel and food, its size meant nothing. American submarines, though small in number, inflicted enormous damage. They sank over half of Japan's merchant fleet, and much of its navy as well. Battleships and aircraft carriers may have captured headlines, but it was the silent submarines that bled Japan dry. The Japanese never truly developed an effective defense. Their anti-submarine warfare was clumsy, their sonar poor, and their escort ships too few. The arrogance of the Imperial Navy, focused on giant fleet battles, left merchant convoys vulnerable. The American submariners exploited this weakness relentlessly. By the time Japan realized the scale of the threat, it was too late. Its factories slowed, its planes ran out of fuel, its soldiers starved on far-flung islands. All because wolves hunted unseen beneath the waves. Picture a Japanese soldier in 1945, sitting on a Pacific island, waiting for rice that never comes, ammunition that never arrives, medicine that will never reach him. He does not know the name of the submarine that sank the freighter carrying his supplies, but he feels its shadow in his hunger, in his weakness, in his despair. That was the true power of the submarine war. It starved an empire without ever setting foot on its shores. The Pacific, once Japan's highway of conquest, was turning into a graveyard of ships. By 1944, the empire's lifelines were collapsing. Convoys that had once sailed confidently now crept along in fear, escorted by desperate destroyers that rarely had the skill or the tools to stop the silent wolves lurking below. For the Americans, the campaign had evolved into a relentless rhythm: hunt, strike, vanish. For the Japanese, it was slow suffocation. Every submarine patrol carried stories of danger and daring. Imagine the USS Wahoo, commanded by the fiery Mush Morton, gliding into a heavily guarded shipping lane. In the silence, the crew watched blips on their sonar, tracking an enemy convoy. Morton ordered a bold surface attack, guns blazing, torpedoes slashing into the convoy. Explosions rocked the night, ships burning against the dark horizon. But with every victory came the thunder of depth charges. For hours, the crew would endure deafening blasts, the hull groaning, the lights flickering, the very ocean shaking around them. They did not know if the next explosion would be their last. Yet somehow, they survived, emerging battered but victorious. Other boats weren't so lucky. The USS Tang, under Richard O'Kane, was among the most successful submarines of the war. O'Kane's daring attacks crippled countless Japanese ships. But fate was cruel. The Tang was sunk in 1944 by one of its own malfunctioning torpedoes. O'Kane and a handful of survivors were captured, enduring the misery of Japanese prison camps. The tragedy of Tang was a reminder that even hunters could become prey. Submarine crews lived with that risk every moment they dove beneath the waves. The Japanese merchant fleet was shrinking at an alarming rate. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were prime targets. Without them, planes could not fly, ships could not sail, and factories could not produce weapons. American submarines made these tankers their prey, and by the end of 1944, Japan's fuel reserves were nearly gone. The empire was running on fumes. By 1945, some Japanese warships never left port because they had no oil to burn. It was as if the veins of the empire had been cut, and the heart was slowly dying. Meanwhile, ordinary Japanese people began to feel the hunger. Rice shipments failed to arrive, and rations shrank. Soldiers in faraway outposts starved. The once proud empire was being starved not by grand battles, but by unseen hunters thousands of miles away. The submarines had turned the Pacific into a blockade, one far more effective than any wall of steel on the surface. Life aboard an American submarine remained brutal. The air grew foul after weeks at sea, sweat dripped constantly in the heat of the engine rooms, and tension never left. When destroyers dropped depth charges, men lay silently in their bunks, praying the hull would hold. Some whispered goodbye to loved ones back home, expecting death with every thunderclap. And yet, despite the terror, there was a fierce pride. Submariners knew their missions mattered. Every ship they sank brought Japan closer to collapse. Every patrol carried the weight of a nation's survival. By the final year of the war, the effect was undeniable. Over 1,100 Japanese merchant ships had been sunk, along with countless warships. American submarines, though only a fraction of the Navy, had inflicted catastrophic losses. The once mighty Japanese Navy was crippled, its supply lines shredded. Cities burned under American bombers, but it was the slow, methodical strangulation from below that ensured Japan could not recover. The wolves had not just hunted, they had devoured an empire's future. The end came in August 1945, with mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But long before the atomic bombs fell, Japan's fate was sealed in the silence of the ocean. The submarines had bled it dry, made its armies helpless, and left its people starving. When Japan finally surrendered, it was not only because of the fire from the sky, but also because of the hunger from the sea. Picture the final scene, a Japanese harbor in ruins, rusting hulks of merchant ships lying broken, the waters eerily calm. Somewhere far below, the wrecks of submarines rest as well, steel coffins of the men who never returned. Both hunter and hunted, buried together in the vast Pacific. The war ended, but the silence of that ocean still whispers their story. The wolves of the Pacific were not seen, only felt. They did not roar like cannons or blaze like bombers. They struck in silence, again and again, until an empire starved. And when history remembers the great battles, the famous generals, the mushroom clouds, it must also remember the men in cramped steel tubes, who gave their lives to fight a quiet war. Their victory was not loud. It was patient, invisible, merciless. It was the sound of an empire starving in the night.